We've made it to the fourth stock issue, that of the disadvantage. Hopefully, just based on this word, this stock issue should be pretty straightforward. This stock issue is typically referred to by debaters as just the DA or the disad. Never call it that in front of parent judges, especially, but debaters oftentimes just reduce it to that shorthand, especially in their flows. Like, don't write out the entirety of the word disadvantage, just write DA. But the disadvantage, very straightforward, are just negative consequences and undesirable outcomes to the passing of the affirmative plan. The disadvantage is one of the bread and butter arguments of the negative side. It's never brought up in the 1AC. This is not an affirmative argument. The affirmative would prefer that the stock issue of the disadvantage is in fact never brought up. So this is brought up by the negative, only if there are negative consequences to the affirmative plan, but typically in a debate you do want to have a disadvantage as the negative. It provides a direct offensive reason why the plan is actively a bad idea. Just think about it. If your job on the negative is to prove that the affirmative plan is ultimately a bad idea, what better way to do that than to show that there are serious negative disadvantages to passing that plan? So it really helps the negative in terms of showing that the costs of passing the plan, whether literal or figurative, outweigh any of its potential benefits. And so disads, I think a great way to think about it, review your notes from the harms chapter. They are the same types of impacts as harms. Everything that would end up being a good harm could be a good disadvantage. The difference between disads and harms is that a disadvantage is caused by the plan, not by the status quo, whereas harms are caused by the status quo as opposed to a plan. So let's take a look at some disadvantages. So you can see here the resolution on the left and the disadvantage on the right. And these are very broad and generic disadvantages. Typically, you'll get more specific than this, but let's just take a look at them. So the first one is about the United States federal government. That's what USFG is reduced to. Should reduce its military presence in foreign countries. And so what would the disadvantage be? Obviously, that reducing our military presence would hurt our military readiness and prevent us from deterring our adversaries. The negative team would say, no, having the military in foreign places is really important to international stability. Second, if the resolution was about substantially increasing incentives for renewable energy, the disadvantage a negative could go for is that renewable energy is far more costly and expensive than fossil fuels. It would devastate the US economy. I'm not saying whether or not these arguments are right or wrong, by the way. I'm just trying to give you examples of the types of disadvantages negative teams could read. Third, if we are talking about, for instance, enacting substantial criminal justice reform, maybe the negative could go for being more lenient on criminals would increase crime rates in the United States. And finally, on a topic about curtailing domestic surveillance, again, or the negative team could talk about how the NSA wouldn't be able to stop bad things like terrorist attacks. So notice all of these are direct offensive impacts that would be caused by the affirmative plan. These are not defensive arguments, these are offensive. So here are my tips. First, the best disadvantages are not generic to the resolution, but instead specific to the plan. So your disadvantages will probably look different for every round depending on what affirmatives the other team is reading or what plans the other affirmative team is reading. And so you want to make sure to have specific evidence that directly links the plan to a concrete undesirable outcome. And another way of saying this is the same thing, just in inverse, but I just want to emphasize it, is that bad disadvantages are far too overgeneralizing and lack specific evidence. Imagine a debate over alternative energy. Now imagine that the affirmative team stands up and reads solar energy in particular. And they have very specific evidence pertaining to solar energy. And then the negative team stands up and says renewable energy costs too much money. And then they just read a piece of evidence that just says, in general, renewable energy costs too much money. And the affirmative team stands up and says, yes, in general, renewable energy costs a lot of money, but we have specific evidence that says that solar energy in the last 2 years has had its costs decrease dramatically, and in fact, it actually saves consumers money now. You can see that if the disadvantage was just talking about renewable energy but never had anything to say about solar energy, it wouldn't be a great disadvantage. Next, a disadvantage should be an offensive or must be an offensive reason why the plan is an actively bad idea. It cannot be a defensive argument. I see this sometimes where teams will say, now let's go to the stock issue of the disadvantage. And our first disadvantage is that the affirmative team's plan doesn't work. That's not a disadvantage. That goes under solvency. That's saying that the affirmative plan isn't ultimately effective. But any defensive argument is inevitably not going to be a disadvantage because it's not providing a direct reason why the affirmative team is bad or why the affirmative plan is bad. So notice the disadvantage always is about offense. Finally, my last tip here for the negative is to exploit inherency. And we're going to talk about this in depth as we get to the particular speeches. But exploiting inherency is a great way to set up the disadvantage. Again, you'll very rarely on the negative actually make arguments under inherency, but in cross-examination, as you're starting to set up that inherency-solvency double-bind, the tension between the idea that if the plan is such a good idea and there are such big problems in the status quo, why hasn't your plan already been passed yet? Well, you can exploit that basic logical tension in cross-ex to set up the basic story of the disadvantage, the idea that, well, maybe there's a reason why the plan hasn't been passed, and maybe that reason is because of this disadvantage. All of a sudden, inherency here can help to undermine the credibility of the affirmative team's story, and the disadvantage helps to provide an explanation for why the plan hasn't been passed. Now, how does the affirmative respond to the DA? How does the AF respond to the DA? First, there are a number of ways to go about doing it. So first, if you're trying to block the disadvantage, show that there's no link between the affirmative plan and the impacts or consequences of the disadvantage. This is a defensive argument. But nevertheless, it can still be quite effective. So let's say the disadvantage is that renewable energy would damage the US economy. Well, the affirmative team could read a piece of evidence saying that renewable energy does not have a negative effect on the impact or a negative effect on the US economy. Now, of course, the AF would have to have evidence to back up that claim, and they would have to provide a reason why there would be no adverse impacts on the US economy, but that would be a good argument to make. Second, if you want to make that argument more offensive, show why the affirmative plan actively solves the impacts of the disadvantage. So let's see how this is different. Remember, in this first one here, if you're just trying to establish that there's no link between the affirmative plan and the impacts, the affirmative team would say, hey, renewable energy does not actually hurt the US economy, or it doesn't have a substantial cost. In the second one, what the affirmative team would say in that instance is that actually, they could read evidence saying that actually renewable energy would improve the US economy. It would make the US substantial amounts of money. So notice it's kind of similar to the response in number one. However, there's a crucial difference. The first response was defensive, whereas that one I just gave you is offensive. Instead of simply mitigating the negative's impacts, it says that the affirmative plan actively causes something good to happen. Thus, if possible, this strategy to respond to the disadvantage can be really, really ideal. It can provide more reasons why the affirmative plan is a good idea. Now, this isn't always going to be possible, though, right? Like, imagine, for instance, if the resolution was about curtailing domestic surveillance, and the negative team read a disadvantage about how curtailing surveillance on U.S. citizens prevents the NSA from stopping acts of terrorism in the U.S., it would be incredibly hard for the affirmative team to prove that curtailing surveillance somehow allows us to solve terrorism better. I don't think you would probably have a great inroads there, so you're probably just going to need the defensive argument. But still, if you can generate that offense by showing that the affirmative team actively solves the impacts, that can be really persuasive. Third, show that the affirmative team's harms outweigh the negative's disadvantages. Now, hopefully you have some more responses than just this. You don't want to just stand up and say, yes, the affirmative or the negative team is right. There are serious costs to the plan, but our harms are still bigger. Like, we still need to pass the plan. But it's important, I think, to have this argument. It helps the judge especially to understand how they should be evaluating the round. This is actually doing a type of framing, saying that our harms are actually more important than your disadvantages because. And so make sure to provide compelling reasons on this. Let's go through an example. If an affirmative team is reading a plan about letting in more Syrian refugees, and the negative team makes the argument that refugees would have to rely on social services, which could cost the US in terms of money and resources, well, the affirmative team could argue that it's morally reprehensible to put a monetary value on human life. They could say that the moral obligation to help people who are suffering and being killed in their own country should come before or outweigh any concerns about the fact that refugees would cost the US money due to their need for welfare. Finally, I highly recommend, just like I did on the negative, that the affirmative team utilize their inherency story to undermine the credibility of the disadvantage. Right? Show that the disadvantage falls into the same problematic mindset that was outlined in the inherency story. So, for instance, if your inherency story is about how oil companies have spent millions of dollars lobbying the US federal government to convince them to not invest in renewable energies because a man made up fears that renewables would hurt the US economy, well, then the affirmative team could point out that the negative's disadvantages uses the exact same excuses that oil companies have been feeding to politicians for years now. This is one of the many reasons why inherency is such an important stock issue. It's not because judges are often voting on the stock issue of inherency itself, but it provides a compelling story on both sides for the negative and the affirmative to either poke doubt in the affirmative team's plan as a whole and set up the disadvantage, or to provide a compelling story for why the biggest disadvantages against your own case are not credible. So you're still going to have compelling arguments for why the disadvantage isn't true as an affirmative team, but inherency can really help to set your arguments up to be much more successful and more credible than the other teams. So that's a disadvantage. Hopefully this is a nice little introduction. Of course, as we go through the particular videos on each of the speeches, 1AC, 1NC, 2AC, 2NC, I will go into much more detail about how negative teams in particular could deploy disadvantages and how affirmative teams in contrast should try to respond to the disadvantage. But hopefully this gives you a nice overview to the stock issue.